third speaker is Jesse Buckley, who will be speaking on determining causality in obesity.
Okay, great. So I am being asked to talk about causality in obesity, and I'm a new investigator. So I've been on the job at Hopkins for about 6 months. So I thought I would kind of talk about the tools that are new in obesity, which is also kind of a disease that we're still learning a lot about now, and thinking about which tools I think are really promising for the future and how we can get at what's really going on in this really multi-causal sort of disease. Okay, so most people know adiposity is the characterization of obesity. It's excess body fat. And I'm not going to talk about how we measure that and differences in a lot of detail, but it's to say we often in epidemiology studies use BMI, but excess body fat is not really equivalent to BMI. And here we have two individuals with the same BMI, one with 9% body fat and the other one with 21%. So when we're talking about epidemiology studies of obesity and we're using things like BMI, you have to have a really strong signal to see what's really going on. So all of the caveats of bias and measurement are applicable to obesity, and I'm not going to get really far into that, but it's important. And also, most of my talk is going to be about childhood obesity because I'm interested in early life determinants and environmental exposures on childhood obesity. But obesity, the reason we're interested in it and concerned about it is because of its comorbidities and complications. And they can really be far-ranging, and they involve psychosocial and cardiovascular and endocrine complications. And so phenotyping of obesity is really important in terms of what we care about. So if you're fat but you don't have some of these other complications, then we might be less interested than if you're also having high risk of the complications. And so as with many outcomes, it's understanding these phenotypes that is really important. So the cause of obesity we sort of know. Energy in is greater than energy out. So it used to be that this is where it stopped. We thought about diet and exercise, and these were the big risk factors for obesity. And that's where a lot of the work was going on. Can we prevent obesity by focusing on better diets and more physical activity? But behavioral interventions for these haven't really solved the problem. And part of that, it might be that those interventions are not successful for a variety of reasons that I'll discuss more, and part of it might be that those aren't the whole picture. So how can we go beyond these big two risk factors using observational data? So today I'll just kind of talk a little bit about traditional risk factor identification in obesity, and then tools like molecular epidemiology and system sciences very briefly, as the molecular approaches were really talked about in a really great talk earlier this morning. And then my work is looking at causal inference approaches for thinking about how we may intervene to reduce the prevalence of obesity, and thinking about how the public health context of the interventions and exposures that we're concerned about. So here's kind of an example of a risk factor approach for determining an early life exposure associated with childhood obesity. And so here we can see just the plot of, let's see. Your finger's in the way. Thank you. There we go. So here's one where we see these are a bunch of prospective studies from all over the world with different study designs and different exposures, classifications for gestational tobacco smoke exposure, and they all sort of show the signal. So we can use like the Bradford-Hill criteria and say, these are consistent, they have a strong magnitude of effect. If you dose animals with nicotine, they also get fat. And so, we kind of go through that list and we say, okay, well, this looks like a causal risk factor. But really, obesity is very complex, and there aren't going to be many more of these risk factors that are so easy to identify with our traditional tools. And so we're expanding into using approaches in obesity really from cell to society. So the leptin signaling pathway has been characterized pretty recently in the history of obesity. This leptin is the kind of the driver of obesity, one of the drivers of obesity, because it causes you to understand when you're full. And so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the whole pathway, but you can see the fat creates leptin, but there's this whole pathway that involves the brain and the GI tract and other things. So there's a lot of different ways that this pathway can be perturbed by different exposures. And so it's very complex, and we need to use new tools to understand what's going on and how chemicals or other exposures might be interfering with the pathway. So one of the things that we're using a lot more in obesity research is biomarkers of response. But these pathways aren't even known very well about how they lead to obesity. And then when you add on the layer of how do environmental exposures perturb those pathways, there's some limitations in understanding, well, if you have a strong signal with leptin, well, does that going to necessarily lead to an increase in obesity? And what are the situations in which it will or won't, and susceptibility factors? Omics technologies and epigenetics, some of those approaches were talked about earlier this morning. And so I think that these approaches have a lot of opportunities in understanding what's going on and using these also to phenotype individuals at highest risk. And we can use them to leverage innovative study designs like Mendelian randomization and things that might be able to get at these questions in a different way. Like Mary Beth was saying, different study designs that come to the same conclusion is one way to get at the probability of causality. And also thinking about how we might understand the molecular pathways for an insult to cause disease and use that analogy to develop drugs that could also treat obesity. So there's only 6 drugs for obesity. There's hundreds of drugs for other related conditions like hypertension. So if we can understand how, say, an endocrine disruptor might interfere with a thyroid hormone and how that pathway goes to energy balance and metabolism, and there might be drugs with a similar chemical structure to the endocrine disruptor, there's some potential for developing interventions. So the molecular basis of obesity is very complex, but we also know that there is a huge complex system of society in the individuals, family environment, their community environment, and national, regional, and international factors that are all really important in driving the obesity epidemic. So an individual who may not have an intervention on an individual may not be very successful in the context of all of these other layers of outside pressures that also are important, and the interventions at these much larger layers may be more successful in reducing obesity than interventions at an individual level. And so system science is really becoming one of the tools that we're looking at a lot in obesity, and understanding how these systems work together to potentially understand what kinds of interventions are going to be the most successful. So there's lots of different tools in system science, and I don't really work in this field, but I think as a new investigator, it's something where I don't know if I can understand a small exposure without understanding this bigger picture of what's going on. And it also allows us to look at not just multi-level influences, but feedback loops in society, and again, evaluating whether or not certain interventions are likely to be successful. And again, also, understanding that we're limited by the quality of our data. So far in obesity, there haven't been very many applications of system science approaches that really go from cells to society, but these are really promising. And so there's a group at Hopkins that's using a system science approach to looking at childhood obesity, and they have this large health system, sort of a big data kind of scenario where there's actually a lot of geographic variability, which is really important to be able to detect differences across the population. And so they have about 1,300 communities and a ton of kids with repeated measures of BMI. So in this data, they were able to examine 44 of these sort of systems kind of predictors of obesity, and they classified these into food environment, physical activity environment, and the social environment. And the top 2 things that were characterizing obesogenic environments were unemployment and population density. So a lot of times when we think about obesity, we're thinking about a person is not exercising enough, but something like employment might actually be a much larger driver. When we really want to translate and understand, like a small change in an exposure in the context of all these large systems, we have to take all of it into account in I think we need a lot more work on understanding these system science things. And I just also, snack stores and food chains, also important, as you might expect, more intuitively. So they're also looking at epigenetics in a subset of this population to see if DNA methylation of obesity-related genes are associated with BMI, and then connecting some of these more social network things to DNA methylation, trying to understand are these large systems things having also molecular influences on childhood risk of obesity. So this is more of my comfort area, thinking about interventions and how we can estimate the effects of interventions using observational data. So this came out when I was a doctoral student and kind of struck me as being important that in epidemiology, we've been really thinking about risk factor identification, and perhaps we also need to think a little bit more about how we may intervene. And so one of the kind of causal inference tools for thinking about interventions is the potential outcomes framework. And we talked about causal diagrams a bit this morning. And also the G methods are a suite of analysis methods that allow us to estimate effects of interventions. And I think in the context of childhood obesity or obesity in general, we know that a lot of the risk factors that we've identified are difficult to intervene on. So it's important to understand what are realistic interventions that could be done when you're thinking about policy. And the strength of a risk factor is one thing that's important, but also whether it's something that you can intervene on, and how an intervention would actually operate in a population is also an important piece of information to add to that landscape. These also, somebody else mentioned the importance of time, and so you can really incorporate time and longitudinal information in these kinds of models to understand what are the susceptible periods, what are the effects of cumulative exposure, these kinds of questions, and also kind of get around some of the issues around time varying confounding. And I'll show an example in a minute, but I think one of the nice features of these kinds of G methods are that you can estimate the effect of an intervention. So you can use a very complex statistical model with lots of nonlinear or non-parametric kinds of modeling, but you still get an answer out of that that is a number that you can understand, and I'll show an example of that. And you can also directly incorporate cost-benefit analyses, which is really useful for policy questions. So here, just kind of a little contrast. We often use like a regression model to get a beta coefficient that represents some dose response between an exposure and an outcome. And in the intervention kind of framework, we're thinking about the public health impact of an exposure or exposures, and we want to know something like how many cases of obesity could we avoid if we reduced exposure by doing this kind of specific intervention that we estimate from the data. So here's an example from childhood obesity where there were about 1,000 kids in this study that were between the ages of 1 and 5. They're all in the WIC program in LA, and what they did was estimate the effects of kind of intuitive or risk factors that we feel are probably related to obesity, and whether if you actually intervene on these factors, if it would translate to lower BMI Z-scores in the children. And so they looked at things like fast food consumption, eating fruits and vegetables, eliminating sugar-sweetened beverages, playing at the playground every day, and breastfeeding exclusively for 6 months was the one that really seemed to have the most impact. And even combining all of these different interventions at the same time didn't increase the benefit that much more over this intervention on hypothetically making all the women breastfeed for 6 months. Now, making everyone breastfeed for 6 months is not a very realistic intervention, if you are familiar with that. And I'm not exactly sure, what the quality of their data, how they modeled this, but it does go to show that there's, depending on the quality of your data and what you understand to be the confounders, you can at least kind of do a relative assessment of these different kinds of interventions that could be feasibly done. When you're thinking about policy, so I'm going to talk just here about air pollution. So you could have an intervention that capped like how much like say that there's a ambient air quality standard, and you're supposed to be below a certain exposure level. So one intervention would be just to put a limit on an exposure, and then the exposure distribution kind of just gets jammed up here. Or you could have an intervention that shifts everybody's exposure downward. Versus something where, say, with an environmental chemical, you might ban it from being used in a consumer product. So then the exposure distribution is basically just point mass at 0. So when we're thinking about realistically applying interventions, for example, in policy, how you intervene is going to really play a role in how that intervention is going to improve health. And we have to understand that, if it's something where you really have to have super bad exposures to get disease, then jamming everybody here probably would be pretty effective. But if there's a range of exposure, if your exposure response is all across that distribution, then moving everybody down or getting rid of the exposure is going to do a better job. Oops. And so here's just an example of a study where I worked on evaluating potential exposure limits. So this is a study of the Colorado Plateau uranium miners cohort. And we had data, longitudinal, like monthly exposure data from 1950 to 2005, and we estimated their radon-associated lung cancer mortality in the cohort. And so this black line is the lung cancer mortality that was observed, and then we compared this to what would have happened if we could have capped everyone's exposure at different occupational exposure guidelines. And so this is the one that's currently in place, the MSHA guideline. And if that had been in place during the entire cohort experience, and they had actually been able to reduce those exposures, we estimated that there would be about 216 lung cancer deaths from radon avoided. So, and you can see different exposure levels would have had different effects. So this gives you a way to actually just come up with one number that you can have a very complex modeling strategy that goes into this model, but you can still say, here is how many we estimate to have been avoided, and I think it just is really useful for communication. I also thinking about like obesity or other outcomes that have a large number of influences, thinking about how we can model these in an intervention framework. There's a lot of different ways you could intervene, and being very explicit about those interventions is important. So if you were to limit nitrogen oxides exposures by something like this, you're going to just reduce this one exposure, whereas another realistic intervention would be to institute a congestion charge to limit driving trips, which has been done in cities as like in London. And this kind of intervention is going to reduce your NOx exposure, but it'll also reduce other air pollutants, road traffic noise, and potentially increase physical activity if people are using public transit. So the impact of this kind of intervention is going to be very different from this kind of intervention. And right now I'm working with colleagues to kind of extend the G methods to be Bayesian in order to stabilize the model so that you can look at sort of highly correlated exposures and think about how these kind of interventions can be modeled in a more realistic framework. And I guess I'll just stop there. Okay, thank you.